Hello and welcome to Exchanges for another week. It has been an incredible period in the behaviour of how the overall nation, globe and society has behaved over the last 5 years, and therefore I thought who better to get on than a preeminent behavioural and cultural economist, and that's why I invited the wonderful Meg Elkins, senior lecturer at RMIT, on to discuss what's happened in the last 5 years around COVID, the behavioural changes that we've had, and to have a proper exchange about what we have seen in the changes structurally, culturally, and also seasonally that has happened with the economics. So with that, let's get on with this week's Exchanges. Meg, welcome to Exchanges. Happy anniversary. When we are recording this, we're recording it a little bit before the anniversary, but it is the 5-year anniversary of COVID. Can you take me through what you saw from when the World Health Organization put that out? Because you and I have been talking about this sort of leading into this interview and this exchange about what COVID has done in the 5 years since it started.
That first day felt a little bit dramatic for me because my world shifted upside down completely in that I had to go digital, having never done digital classes. So I'm an academic. So within the space of a week, I had to learn how to use a
Hmm.
camera face to face like we're doing now, which it wasn't happening beforehand. Um, but I also had to shift my perspective because remember, it was going
Yeah.
to be for 3 weeks.
Yes.
It was 3 years. And that's a long time to adjust your thinking. It's for much of it, um, we didn't know where the finish line was. So the finish line kept on evolving and changing. And when we're running a marathon, we know where the finish line is. And we adjust ourselves psychologically to understand where that finish line is. And we actually get to the point where we're going, okay, we've only got 5Ks to go. But for us here, particularly in Victoria, those goalposts kept changing, which meant that the uncertainty kept changing, which meant the anxiety kept changing. So not only were we dealing with a global pandemic, we were also dealing with physical uncertainty, mental uncertainty, and financial uncertainty. And in a way, it's a perfect storm because, COVID was a perfect storm because we hadn't actually had a pandemic since 1913. So that was the Spanish flu in 1913. And in 1913, it's not the same situation. So we didn't have a rule book. And the rule book was being created as we came along. And so not only did we not know where the timeline, the end was in sight, we also didn't know how to deal with it. We were trusting our government in a way we hadn't done before. And there was another factor that came in here as well. Um, we thought we could get sick, and we thought we could get so sick we could die. So there's so much anxiety in that space. Um, and I know I wrote a book chapter on what happens for that COVID time. And what was most important was the messaging that we had to trust the people in power to do the right thing. But they too didn't have a rule
So
book.
I want to sort of go down that path because I also, love this space. You and I work in the behavioral side of it. The changes that have happened in 5 years are just astounding. I mean, one of the stats that I love pointing out that COVID did was it took 37 years up to COVID for us to get to 20% of all sales happening online. And in the space of the first 8 months of COVID, it jumped to 28. And since then, so when you and I are speaking now, it's now near enough to 32%
Mm.
of all sales. And so
Um,
it clearly
yeah.
shows the changes and the behavior movements in it. I mean, the other thing that was also really fascinating, you just highlighted is trust. And I want to really go into that because one of the arguments that I kept having working in the world that I do with behavioral economics and same with you is that as soon as you break trust, you can't repair it. And so the year that was fascinating to me was 2021 in terms of how that trust was starting to crack, and then clearly for us here in Victoria, it broke in terms of where it is. What did you notice in your world? What was the studies that were starting to come out that showed that A, we'd started to lose trust in government, but B, that also that we've now had structural behavioral changes that are now basically still happening in terms of what we do. Yes, there is.
There's a lot to unpack there, Evans. So, the first thing that you
Mm,
talk about is digitalization. And to my mind, that has been the biggest shift. What what happened was we needed a shove, and the shove was enormous. We didn't get a choice. So you had to become familiar with QR codes, with online banking, with online ordering, with online. Everything was online. My world became online. And that shift towards digitalization, I mean, I did a couple of studies on this.
mm.
I worked with buskers, and their livelihood completely went upside down. But we noticed an exponential rise in digital tipping. For me, that's fantastic because I now get access to data that I never had before because no one ever knows what buskers get tipped. So as an economist, that was really exciting for me. But for
I
people
wanna
whose
interrupt you. More
livelihood
or
was
less than you
cash,
expected.
more or less exponentially,
Okay.
it's continuing to rise. So it flat like exactly like you talked about retail online. We watched it go flat, 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 flat. We introduced digital tipping. It meandered for the first 4 years, and then you just saw the slope increase, and it's exponentially rising
We're
because
doing it.
now we're familiar with
Yeah, 'cause then the next
those
part
that
of it is that,
technology.
you look at that technology now with things like Uber Eats or with Deliveroo or with Menulog. At the end of it, there's, do you wanna tip your driver? Do you wanna actually, is that learned, that the big companies have learned from the COVID era that's now filtering into what they do? Is that part of,
There's
yeah,
a lot of behavioral stuff behind that, and that's the element of guilt tipping for that we use defaults to now help people choose amounts. We are not only used to digital elements now, but we're also used to, learning more about the consumer because we've got more data. So those data points now know how we can nudge, for the want of a better word, consumers into giving more, into doing probably behaviors that they didn't do before because we've got that information on how to shift behavior. Um, dare I say, we
and
can use
possibly
it to
to
our
our disadvantage
advantage.
at the same time.
To our yeah,
Yeah,
well,
and
there's
so
sludge and there's
that
nudge.
nudge that
There's
we've clearly now got electronically and digitally from the COVID era brings to where we are right now out of the COVID world, which you and I also speak aloud a lot, which is this buzz term, cost of living crisis, and where it sits,
Mhm.
how it looks, and what it is. That digital behavior, is that also now, with the cost of living crisis and the data that you see, pushing us towards, again, the working from home or the home experience over domestic experience? Because the data that I look at for sure shows that the domestic experience, going out, getting a coffee, going to a restaurant, etc., is still absolutely, waning. It bounced in 2022, but hasn't moved.
Yeah.
International experience is something I'll ask you in a minute because that's different. Is that all part of what we now know, is that we can get the service, we can get the digitalization, we don't have to socialize, and in our minds, it's cheaper to go down that path rather than going out?
Yeah. You touch on some really nice points there because we are creatures of habit, and the habit formations happened in COVID where we were at home. And to some extent, we became agoraphobic of wanting to be amongst people, but we became lazy in our behavior as well. Netflix is now not a luxury, it's a necessity. Our subscriptions rose. Our cultural participation actually has fallen in away from where it was in 2019. So we're out of the habit of going out, and the things that make us go out are often big events rather than the smaller events. So we have adjusted, and we know that the work flexibility, the hybrid way of working has become the norm. And if there is a case where people are asked to come into the office 5 days a week, it's almost an outrage. I know Amazon has done this. I know that, several big, large organizations have done this, and it's almost a backlash of how can you? But I would say that also we now weigh up the cost of going out in every decision. There's a little bit of mental accounting that goes on. If I come into my office here, I have to pay $10.60 in a in my Mikey fare. The cost of a coffee is $5. If I don't bring my lunch in, then that's another amount. So I'm weighing up the cost of that meeting that I'm doing face to face versus my home office. And I'm not alone in this decision, but I'm only 6 Ks out of the city. Someone else who's actually um, out actually further away, an hour out of the city, um, has a bigger decision to weigh up. During COVID this time, one of the favorite articles I wrote in the conversation was called "The Paradox of Commuting." And this article said, went to a principle that said the ideal work, place away from your work is about half an hour. It's the Marchetti's principle, and then you move out subsequently from that, and there are impacts beyond those that are an hour out. So in COVID, we saw big shifts of workers moving regionally beyond that hour out. So them coming back to the office is an absolute trade-off. We know that we have foot data in the CBD that actually measures how active people are. Tell me what days you think most people avoid coming into the city.
Monday and Friday. Friday.
Choose one.
They don't come in.
They don't come in?
Okay.
It's Monday. It's Monday. So Monday, they don't come into the city. And interestingly, we spike on the weekend. Like people are
that's interesting, 'cause
slowly coming back
again,
to the city on the weekend.
anecdotally, in looking at what I've seen, is the reason I made that choice is cars on the road on a Friday is significantly lower than any other day that I'm out and about. And I wonder if it's because they can work from home and make it a feel of a longer weekend, rather than Monday,
Yeah.
where I would have thought, again, anecdotally, that they were getting everything done faster, sooner, and quicker, so they can then have that slightly longer day. But
I must admit this data is
no, I
last
but I
year, so it
understand
could
your
be
point. I
changing
mean,
this year.
I'm gonna sort of jump in a little bit here and sort of some of the things that you've just said in my world, particularly when I talk to people in property, absolutely makes 110% truth. So Australia is a really strange country in the fact that the more money that we make, the closer we like to be to where we work. So, we have
Mhm. And there's a whole it dates back, this is so interesting, from the it almost
Yeah.
dates back to primeval times, because you think about the village, that like the feudal system where you could only walk half an hour, and then you get the pony, and you can be a little bit further out, and then you get the car, and then you get the train, the steam train, and a little bit further out, and then you get the car. So these principles have been around almost
Yeah,
since we've had that work relationship with working for a boss, like the feudal system to
which
to then
which
getting
possibly also
different modes of
explains why,
transport.
again, you look at our, global peers, you look at somewhere like New York, they commute into Manhattan, but they live in Westchester or they live in Long Island. You look in the UK, London, they don't
Mhm.
really live anywhere in, zone 1. They live out in zone 4, 5, or probably more likely out into the zones. This is the same
Yeah.
in Paris. You can also highlight Berlin as well in terms of that. Whereas we go the other way, and you've just highlighted it's clearly around infrastructure, right? The ability to do it. But also part of what I've seen in their culture and the behavior is that they can accept transport time in value, because you spoke about that 30 minutes. The It's not, value isn't just obviously monetary, although it's clearly part of it. The value is the time lost. Like, how much of my time is the value that I'm losing by moving for 2 hours a day, an hour in and an hour out, or whatever time period it happens to be. And from the COVID experience, sitting still and doing all the work from home, all of a sudden that time value was completely returned to you, right? There was a dividend payout that was just incredible. It's 100%. So that, I think, is what hasn't been given up. Now, because I want to go back.
The time that yeah, it's a time
Yeah,
versus
yeah.
money trade-off that we have there. And the shift in COVID has shifted that value between time and money. And where we've seen it most prevalent, perhaps, is the students that I'm teaching, that they have a perception now because they lived in those years at home that their time is more valuable. They have stronger boundaries on that encroachment in their time. And
Yeah,
this is a shift for us in my generation, that also that giving above and beyond for
does
work
that
was just the
do
norm,
you think that also
and
feeds
that's
into
now
the data
shifted
that's been
for them.
shown at the moment that we have the lowest level of people living with each other pretty much since sort of records are being done. So, there is now 2.4 per people per household in Australia. In the cities, it's about 2.4. In the regions, it's 2.2. If you look at rental data, pre-COVID, it was about 3.8 to 4.2 people per household. Now rental data is showing it's about 2.8 to 3.6, and a big portion of that is normally students. Is that because students are also now working out we keep hearing it, they're living at home more rather than actually living with each other? It's cheaper for them to live at home rather than actually living with each other. But also, as you said, that time factor of all of that additional, do I need to live in the city or in an apartment near the university that I am going to when I can do what you and I are doing right now and do the whole thing digitally?
There is an enormous shift in that, and the shift that we're seeing because cost of living is so prevalent, and you have to remember, um, this
Mm,
generation hasn't seen inflation. They haven't seen cost of living prices. Well, they have now. They've lived with it for 2 years, but previous to that, the concept of inflation
foreign. Yeah.
was brand new. The concept of, they weren't living with that. So there's also been a cultural shift that's been on with them. We've also seen, a rise in people returning to their home, not being 20, but being 40. Like, there has to be changes in the way um, that we live, but we also are a bit more fragile now. Our concept of intergenerational living is
Mm.
it's we have to live with it. It's not just a thing that happens in China. It's actually happening here. That big shift towards independent has been delayed. And I think that it's shifted the cultural values of young people as well, because the things that they value aren't things that necessarily previous generations valued. So there's not a concept that they're going to buy a house. If I ask my students how many people would be thinking about buying a house in 5 to 10 years' time, it's aspirational, but they don't think it's achievable. So they shift their spending to um, work-life balance, and they shift their focus to international travel and aspirational elements of their life in a way that perhaps I think I'm a generation above you, and your generation just the grind was par for the course. It's not so par for the course now,
Yeah.
and that's the shift. The big shift is in the younger generation pushing the older generation to question the values and aspirations that we had and whether they motivate
Because I
them in
make
the
that
same
same
way.
point. I mean, I sit in the older end of the millennials, but I am technically a millennial. And until COVID in Australia, we hadn't had, I mean, the GFC was there, but we didn't experience it like the rest of the world. So we still managed to stay. Yeah,
We did for
which
2
was,
months.
sort of March
Yeah, that's
2008,
I mean, Kevin Rudd gave
and that
us a
was
little
about it.
cash push
But
that
for my
actually did
generation,
shift.
we had never had an interruption to choice ever. So, I mean, the oldest millennial now is 42 or 44, depending on when you want to talk about them. Some actually maybe even as much as just turned 45, if you're talking about 1980. But they would have been kids during the recession we had to have and the other inflation story back and then. So they have never experienced an interruption to choice, as what you're alluding to there, Meg, in terms of that intergenerational living with each other, the choice around essential to essential rather than actually essential to discretionary spending. This is what the next part of our conversation comes with, this change of inflation that we keep hearing now, that inflation's, back to target. We are doing this just before the first RBA meeting of 2025. For all arguments,
90% of there's a
yeah,
90%
yeah, but even
thinking
for
that this is
me,
gonna happen. So
is
let's see if
right.
that
Because
10%
what
is
my
has got
argument
any.
is that it doesn't go away, right? We're talking about the rate of change of inflation, not the accumulated change of inflation. Compound interest still plays a part. So we've had, as we speak, about a 23% increase from the start of what was buzzed the cost of living crisis to where we are, you and I are today. If we are happy to accept just over 3% year on year, core inflation, compound interest shows you that over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to be further ahead than if we were to accept 2 to 2.5%. Is this also the other dilemma that economists, bankers, politicians are facing in this new change of structural behavioral differences that they're having to bend to get back to what we wanted? Or are we saying that we are happy to choose a slightly higher inflation rate to satisfy the values that we still believe we want because we want to consume? As you said, the younger generation's no longer saving for a house, they're saving for experience. Is this all part of that question? I know that's really broad, but that's why we talk about exchanges here, is that this is what goes through my head and what keeps me up at night, is that the cost of living has changed the idea that going out, getting a coffee, it's going to be $6.50 to $7 before we know it. How do we deal with that? Mm,
It is a shift, and we talked at the start about habits and habit formation, and
yeah.
habits take a while to shift. So there I know perhaps if you interview someone today and say, "What are you gonna do if the interest rates change?" They'll talk to you about saving for a holiday, eating out more. But these things take time to do. I don't think there's gonna be a rush on elements. I think people are just gonna dig deeper into their mortgage. To me, it feels like, um, people aren't gonna change behavior to this straight away. It's gonna take 6 months to at least change the way we think about, rates coming down. You've got to remember that there are 2 sides to interest rates coming down. It's savings, on the other hand, from, retirees, like a third of people actually own their own homes. So for them, they're probably going to have reduced, uh, savings coming because their interest rates aren't as high. And for those 2/3 that have mortgage, um, I think there's a level of wait and see that's going to happen here. I don't think it's gonna shift, um, housing just yet. I People are cautious at the moment. They've been stung, and they've had things taken away, and we know that with behavioral economics, we fear losses more than we appreciate gains. So, uh, I don't think people are gonna rush out and spend. I think it will take time to shift, um, and I also think that we have adjusted. It's taken us a while to diminish our wants. I don't For me, I think we're
Mm.
talking about habits here, and, habits take a long time to form. So, it took us a long time to readjust. There was a lot of this inflation was driven somewhat by the revenge economy that we've been that we've been shut down, and that, we wanted to experience life again. Coupled with, supply chain issues from from China, from the Ukraine war, like, this was all cumulated external things that were going on, but also internal things. We wanted to live again, and for God's sake, we needed to live again. We were deprived. So inflation actually came about from a point of what you talk about structural, external factors, but there were internal factors driving this as well. And some of it was government prompted. The subsidies that we had for construction and housing, we
Well,
look back on that now and we think, "What the hell were we doing?" to push up this construction boom. Um, so inflation happened at from these factors, and it took us a while to dampen. It took us a while to understand the levers that did it. It does. The government did help. It reduced energy. We don't. It also we had a tax cut. So to me, there's all these factors going on in the economy. Is it going to be a rush on spending? And I think if you interviewed someone today before the changes and they'd say, "What are you gonna spend on? You're gonna spend on a holiday. You're gonna s Are they gonna buy the plasma screen TV like they did with the baby bonus?" I It's not enough to do that. And there's 2 factors that go on with interest rates. There's the retirees that are going to get less in their savings, or perhaps those that own their homes that are going to get less in their savings. And that's a third, and 2/3 are actually the mortgage, those that have mortgage. And we know that with those people, that there's probably gonna be some level of, um, fear or of losses, uncertainty here. And as a behavioral economist, we talk about this idea of loss aversion, that we fear losses more than we appreciate gains. So my sense is it's taken a long while to slow down that behavior. It's going to take equally as long.
Yeah, I'm sort of with you on that as well, because the change in behavior that was the most telling for me, and the habit we developed faster than I could imagine, was the switch Australians went from being spenders to savers. Like how fast from 2019, where the data technically was saying that we are more of a spending, cohort than a saving cohort. Since COVID, it's clearly the opposite way around. And although savings rates now are really, as thin as they've been since about 2018, it's not because we're spending more, it's because we're servicing a mortgage, or we are, basically spending on the essentials. So I don't think one, I don't even think two will necessarily move the dial. My concern, as I said before, is it does, and we have seen changes in forward-looking data like confidence, forward-looking data like expending expectations. They have popped up on the idea that rate cuts are coming. So I'm with you. I mean, I always refer back to loss aversion and what Cartman and Tversky always talked about with that concept, which is we feel that much more acutely than anything else. My only caveat concern that I have around this whole sort of scenario that we're about to go through with the 25-26 rate cut cycle is the other side of it, which is, yep, we probably won't move till there's two, maybe three rate cuts, and savings will be part of it. But you've also got government spending that is clearly ramping up and ramping up further. And then the fact that you can't stop time, right? So this is the next thing that we've just talked about over this interview about the last 5 years is we realized we couldn't stop time. So we had, you only live once, YOLO expectations, 2022, 2023, where we just went crazy to sort of make up for 2020 and 2021. Is that the next thing that we start to develop? Is that, again, experience, as you've talked about with with your younger cohort that you speak to, starts to trump, and experiences do have that whole concept of spend. Is that what could be the concern going forward, that we do start to see a pop of inflation in areas that normally, even with a rate cutting cycle, should still be moderating, which is overseas travel, domestic movement? Is that the only concern that you have there, that therefore we have, again, a problem around demand because demand is still high because of the behavior that we're going to get from a slightly better savings rate that allows us to spend a little bit more than we already had?
There's what you talk about are experiences, but perhaps the big rise
Mm.
has been in services as well. We aren't probably spending on things as much as we are spending on services and experiences. So those services we've particularly seen rises in. Um, my big interest in where we're spending is actually in health, and how COVID has
Mm.
shifted our health behaviors. Uh, and I don't know whether this is social norms because we're being conscious of our health, but are we getting sicker? Is my question. Is that why we're rising, or are we getting more preventative? Are we thinking about, um, we're more conscious of our bodies and keeping up. So part of it is experiences, but part of it is also a deeper understanding. I feel like it's not Keating's the pandemic we had to have, but it did actually it's what as an economist, if I had data, I'd talk about it as a regression discontinuity. There's a line in the sand here that really shifted what we value and how we value it. So health was one of those things that we valued. Yes, experiences. I'm still feeling like
Hmm.
we're still isolated. We're not connected as much as we should be. And perhaps the digital age, one of the things that really impacted us was the move towards screens. Um, and this all happened 2012 was that moment where screens became part of our lives. And I think that time in COVID meant that shift towards the screens um, hasn't been a good shift for people emotionally or psychologically, and particularly the young people that didn't have those social behaviors worked out just yet. I
No, I
don't
think
know
you
if I've
have, because I
answered
want to
your question, but I've answered the question
I
that
want to
I wanted
expand
to
on that, because I
answer.
think that's the other fascinating part is, again, looking at the health expenditure arm that you talk about. This is why, that I am a little bit hesitant about, multiple rate cuts and where we spend, because health, if you look at health expenditure, it's running at about 6% per annum in terms of it's incredibly robust, which is well above trend. I mean, it always expands at a fairly
Yes.
reasonable clip.
That's the thing that to me is
Yeah.
like, is this driven there's 2 parts. Is it preventative
Or is it social?
or are we
So
getting
that's the other,
sicker
that's what I
is the
wanted to ask. That's
question.
the question. Or is it the third element? Is it social? Is it because you are now being bombarded with it with your screen? Because health and health expenditure goes hand in hand with the meteoric rise of health social. So you look at not just what happens on social media, but you look at what happens with devices. And I mean, I'm wearing one at the moment, my Apple Watch.
I
Oh, there
feel like
probably
there's a
is. And
paper
so
in this, Evan. I think that you talk about my little research head said, "I think you found an interesting relationship here that could
because
actually
it,
be explored. Do
it's
you wanna
above
write a
trend,
paper
right?
on
So
this?"
the expenditure, the demand
It
for it
is above trend,
is
and it's been
above trend.
fascinating me. Do you
Yeah,
think this is
TikTok health,
TikTok health?
Instagram health, but then you look at,
Yes,
one of the things that the second biggest company now, Apple, has taken and run with, it's also the fourth largest company on the world in Meta, and the fifth in Amazon, is wearable health and wearable health expenditure that comes with that. And yeah,
and we're monitoring that behavior in
correct.
ways we haven't done before, and if wherever you put your attention, that's where
Yeah, and so
your
it's confirmation
attention
bias, it's attention
lies.
bias, it's attribution bias, and the whole 9 yards all goes into
Yes.
this,
Tick,
which,
tick, 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 tick,
again,
yes.
that's what I mean is that if we are gonna get interest rate cuts, what do we put it towards? And I would argue that a health service, being, your Apple Watch or whatever Alexa is gonna tell you, or what happens to be going on in that space, the demand for that is, only exponential, because again, the reach is getting larger and larger by the day. Your screen is in front of you telling you you're not healthy. And so that's what I also sort of am fascinated by what you've just said there with regards to, is it preventative, or is it something else? Or is it the third one that I said, driven by the
Driven
algorithm
by
and
the
driven therefore by
algorithm.
the social idea that health is now the main thing. So that's a question that I think won't be able to answer today, because we're going to need the data.
Well, this is really interesting you say this. I know there's a researcher up at Melbourne Uni that's looking at, body image and actual, people that haven't used TikTok before, and what they monitored was how long it took to go to extreme content. So
Hmm.
let's say you're looking at healthy bodies and something like that, looking at diet, it took 6 minutes on average for TikTok to
And then
go
you go
to
back to loss
extreme
aversion, right?
content.
So
And so these novice, like this is just people
Yeah.
that have never been on the site before. Our algorithms are driving extreme behaviors. So I
'Cause
think you're
that's the
onto
economics,
something
right?
here.
That
And I
drives you
know
back
that,
to the idea, I don't want to lose my health.
yeah,
I don't wanna lose the
no.
value that my health gives me in society and in my economic world and my finances.
So
I don't
are
think
we
so.
getting sicker? I don't know that, but maybe I think we're getting conscious of this. And perhaps that COVID is a push towards that conscious living. I think we can still like that. I think we can still do better with community and social engagement. That's my
Yeah,
that's the key to happiness. I don't think like health is yeah okay we're exercising more what da da da, but
yeah,
we've got to
I'd
be
agree.
social.
So
And I here we are talking on screen, this would be much better if we were meeting face to face. I can't get your nuances of your face and your reactions and what you're doing here. I'm having a limited experience of this. So I it's been great to be digital. I've done things that I've never probably done before because of that digital experience. Has it made my life happier? I know I did I was in part of a debate last year for International Women's Day around this time of year. And with very famous comedians and me, uh, totally intimidating. And I was on the team uh, that we aren't better off than we are now. So the debate question was, are we better off where we are now? And my debate was, I don't think we are better off because of what I'm seeing in terms of mental health impacts of us not engaging socially. And can
yeah,
I say we won
and I
the debate?
and so that brings me to the last question that I always ask my guests, which is, if you were in charge for one day, what would you change and what would you do?
I'd
Yeah.
get off screens.
Was that ban the whole world from?
I would absolutely digitally detox. I am a great, advocate for Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, but he also wrote a book about moral foundations of that why good people differ on religion and on, politics. And I would say that a lot of the division and the anxiety that we feel is not driven by something that comes within us, it's an external element. And I'm subject to this as well. Don't think that because I talk about these
Mm,
things, I'm immune to
same.
them. Just one day off screens. Just one day
So
off screens.
International No
I
Screen Day.
think we need to have international off the screen day and then, get come out of your house and engage and talk. And I think that we've lost water cooler conversations because we're working from home, where we're not engaging in public debate, which means that we're fearing other more than we've experienced in our lives. And that fear of other has driven us to the point where we are now of not feeling like we can meet our relatives that have different opinions. Like, we're meant to debate, we're meant to engage, we're meant to exchange ideas, we're not meant to be in silos, we're not meant to cancel culture. Where we get true exchange, and this is the part of your podcast, Evan, that is the joy of sharing information and learning and growing. So, get off your algorithm and start having
That is an absolutely
conversations.
fantastic point to finish up. Meg Elkins, thank you so much for joining Exchanges.
Thank you, Evan. So my pleasure, really.
What a fantastic Exchanges episode. Was so happy to get Meg's amazing mind in front of you, because she sees things from the numbers and the data that she gets at the university in ways that we don't always see. And I loved her understanding about the changes that we've had from our overall cultural movement from COVID and what it's led through to the cost of living crisis, how we look at property, what it means for health and our health spending, also through to just things like the digital revolution that has rapidly increased in the last 5 years. So Meg, thank you so much for being part of Exchanges. I hope you out there really loved it. And with that, we want you to be part of the society, of the culture, of the community that is the Exchanges podcast. Please, therefore, just jump on and subscribe down below, either through your podcast or the YouTube channel that you're watching this through. And also, to send in any questions, please get them back into us. We love reading them. We'd love to have your ideas about other guests like Meg to have on. That's exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. But for now, thank you again for joining another episode of Exchanges. We'll see you again next week.